All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. It is day 2 of the Russian invasion into its neighboring nation of Ukraine, and Russia's forces continue to press deep into the Ukrainian territory. Now, according to reports that have come in, the battle has now reached the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Meanwhile, in a midnight address, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that his country has been left alone to fight against the Russian onslaught after Vladimir Putin announced an invasion into Russia. He also warned that the Russian sabotage groups had entered into the capital city of Kyiv and has urged all residents within Kyiv and indeed across Ukraine to be vigilant and to observe the curfew rules.
Але є й друге. Ми залишаємось наодинці у захисті нашої держави. Хто готовий воювати разом з нами? Чесно, не бачу таких. Хто готовий дати Україні гарантію вступу до НАТО? Чесно, всі бояться.
Now, across Ukraine, according to reports that have come in at this point of time, at least about 137 people, both military personnel and civilians, have been killed in the first day of the incursion by the Russians. President Volodymyr Zelensky has called up for conscription and reservist soldiers countrywide to come and fight, as he's ordered for a general mobilization. So far, at least about 100,000 people are said to have been displaced as Russian missiles have rained down on Ukrainian cities. The first of the Ukrainian refugees are already beginning to trickle into places such as Hungary, Romania and Poland. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what Russia, of course, intends to achieve through this incursion into Ukraine, we're joined in by Dr. Malcolm Davis, who's joining us live from Canberra. Dr. Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this broadcast on WION. This is day 2 of the incursion by the Russians into Ukraine. And according to reports that have come in, at least about 137 of the Ukrainian both military personnel and civilians have died so far. How long do you expect this incursion by the Russians to continue?
Correct term. It's not an incursion, it's an invasion. Okay, they're completely different things. This is a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the objective being to dismember Ukraine, to forcibly remove the democratically elected government, and to redraw the territorial boundaries of Ukraine by brute force. So this is not going to be over quickly. This is going to take many weeks, potentially months to play out. And the notion suggested by President Putin that he would not occupy Ukraine is nonsense. The Russians are clearly planning on occupying Ukrainian territory, including probably capturing the capital, Kyiv. So this is full-on war. It's not an incursion.
It's interesting the way you've described this. Of course, is full-on war in terms of how the Russians have gone about it so far. But over the course of the last several weeks, everyone has been talking as to what could be the Russian objective in case it decides on military action. And now that Russia, of course, has started with its military action, how far will Russia, of course, go? In 2014, Russia had a clear plan. It went in and it annexed Crimea. What do you think Russian objective is this time round?
As I said, to remove the government by force and put in place a puppet regime that is loyal to Moscow. Secondly, to carve out a significant portion of Ukraine, essentially extending from the Donbass to the Dnieper River, including Kyiv, including the south coast along from Mariupol through to Odessa, as Russian territory. Putin is basing a lot of his decision-making on a historical belief that somehow Ukraine was part of Russia. When in fact Ukraine predated Russia. And so I think that you should expect this to be a prolonged, bloody, brutal conflict rather than some sort of limited incursion or special military operation as Putin is describing it.
All right, and also we have been looking at how the West is, of course, trying to put up a united front against Russia. There was talk of creating a deterrence for Russia from, carrying out this military operation. But at this point, looking at how the West has, of course, been responding, it is still talking of financial sanctions. Do you think financial sanctions will suffice to deter Russia from pursuing what it is doing in Ukraine?
Well, clearly not, because it's pursuing it already. The sanctions were there to try and prevent Russia from launching a full-scale invasion, and it's launched a full-scale invasion. So the sanctions haven't worked in that sense. Where the sanctions, I think, can be successful, particularly if they're ramped up in intensity and pain on Moscow, is to increase the cost to Moscow financially and diplomatically, so that they realize that, in actual fact, their military adventurism in Europe, their use of warfare to achieve policy ends, does not come away scot-free. So I think that sanctions are important. It's important we increase their intensity over a prolonged period. And it's important that we target the right individuals in Russia, in particular the Siloviki, the oligarchs around Putin, to make them feel the pain and their families made to feel the pain, rather than just trying to punish the Russian people.
Now, at this point of time, the information that has come in where the Americans have said that they are not yet imposing energy-related sanctions. With that being the case, do you think this policy of the West, led by the United States, to impose sanctions and to target some high-profile individuals within Russia, is not even going to work if the West does not now begin to crack down and start imposing energy-related sanctions that is going to financially affect the Russians?
I think that is correct. I think that there does need to be much tougher sanctions imposed in coming days and weeks, recognizing that the sanctions are not going to get the Russians to reverse their invasion. What the sanctions need to do is essentially isolate Russia, to place real pressure on Putin and his regime. You're already seeing protests in Moscow and other Russian cities against the war. Right. I think that as Russian soldiers are killed in this conflict and they start to come home in body bags, those protests will swell. So we need to calibrate the sanctions alongside those popular unrests to increase the pressure on the Russian government to ultimately force Putin to back down, potentially from going beyond Ukraine, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it has to be done to prevent Putin from going beyond Ukraine. Speaking of what is likely to happen over the course of the next few days and weeks, if Russia were to get its way in Ukraine, do you think Russia would stop at Ukraine?
I think that Russia has a long-term objective to overturn the outcome of the Cold War. So what it wants to create is a sphere of influence throughout Central Europe. And one of its original demands to NATO was for NATO to withdraw to 1997 borders. That's very clear that Russia wants to impose a sphere of influence across much of Central Europe, including the Baltic states, including Poland, Hungary, Romania, and so on. And we can't allow that to happen. So I think that one of the things that NATO needs to focus on is how to deter and defend Central Europe against Russian aggression in the future. As you say, if they are successful in Ukraine, they might be tempted to try elsewhere. And with those Russian forces based in Belarus, they are well placed then to threaten the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, this conflict as it has played out for the last several weeks, we saw diplomatic efforts. We saw a lot of Western leaders, go about diplomatically to try and deter Russia. That has clearly not worked. But the crux of this entire crisis is what Russia says has been a Ukrainian political inclination to join the NATO military alliance. Now, Ukraine is not a part of the NATO military alliance, and therefore NATO is not duty-bound to protect its borders. But the fact is, Ukraine is not a part of the alliance, and therefore it has invited this onslaught from the Russians and virtually is getting dismembered. Is there a failure on the part of the NATO military alliance in fact safeguarding those nations that are friendly towards the NATO military alliance and would want to be a part of the NATO military alliance?
I think that's correct. I think that there needs to be a status that emerges for these sorts of states that are pre-membership, if you like, that should have some additional security guarantees from NATO, certainly additional military assistance from NATO. I think that the West in particular and NATO moved way too slowly when it became clear last year when Russia deployed forces up to Ukraine's border. They should have started acting then in terms of reinforcing Ukraine and starting to fast-track Ukraine's membership. I think if Ukraine had become a member of NATO, maybe Putin would not have been so eager to attack because of the consequences of attacking a NATO state. There's still that threat with the Baltic states who are NATO members, but Putin may feel that he can grab those states quickly and NATO won't respond. Ukraine is a much bigger state. So I think that there is a challenge there for NATO, as it relates, for example, to Sweden and Finland. Right. How do you defend states that want to join NATO but are directly under threat from Russia?
Absolutely, indeed. My last question to you, Mr. Davis, is this, of course, is going to be a very difficult conflict for the people of Ukraine. We heard the Ukrainian president where he said that his nation is all alone in fighting the Russian onslaught. Now, do you expect, as this conflict continues to drag on, the West, especially the United States, would be more willing to, in some ways, assist Ukraine, besides just imposing financial costs on Russia?
Well, we're already providing military support, and I'm sure we're providing real-time tactical intelligence support to the Ukrainians as well. But your question goes to the potential next step in terms of some sort of direct military intervention. Putin made it very clear, I think, in his warning yesterday, that if NATO does intervene in this crisis, then Putin is prepared to escalate. The Russians have a strategy called escalate to de-escalate, where they move towards threatened use or actual use of tactical nuclear weapons to coerce NATO to back down in a crisis. So I think Putin's words were implicit, a suggestion that he could be willing to use tactical nuclear weapons. NATO would have to think long and hard before they got involved militarily in this crisis, given that risk. The other issue, of course, is some sort of inadvertent or mistaken incident where a NATO aircraft is shot down or a ship is attacked, and NATO then have to decide how they're going to respond to that scenario. But it's a very dangerous game once you get into this, given Russia's willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Davis, for joining us from Canberra and giving us all those insights in terms of how this conflict might actually shape out in the next few days to come. So this is how the situation stands at this point of time, where it is day 2 of the Russian onslaught into Ukraine. And according to information that has in fact come in, at least about 137 people in Ukraine, including both military personnel and civilians, have died. Tensions are rising in Eastern Europe. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.